Hello, historians. We'll be discussing the 1950s culture today. Um, we've been focusing on the Cold War that really started ramping up in the 1950s. And people were, afraid of nuclear annihilation, right? The Soviet Union, the Red Scare, McCarthyism, hydrogen bombs. This is all ramping up during the 1950s. We watched the duck and cover videos. Hopefully, you watched that link. And so um, even though the Cold War was on the back of everybody's minds, there was a lot of stuff going on in America and a lot of changes that were happening in this country during the 1950s. You might look back at the 1950s and think it might have been a little boring, a little bland, especially compared to the next decade that's about to happen, the 1960s. The 1960s is definitely a decade where a lot of changes happen. You could take an entire class on just the 1960s with all the different things that were happening. But the 1950s are going to kind of lead the way into the 1960s a little bit. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about the culture of the 1950s. Oh, I had a little music, but it doesn't work on these things, of course. So post-war America, World War II is over with, right? The soldiers, millions of soldiers are coming home, and they need, now they've got some money in their pockets. They need places to live. And one of the things that is new in the 1950s are the suburbs. They start building these developments just outside the cities where people can buy a car and drive into the city and work and then drive home to the suburbs just outside. It kind of starts off on the East Coast a little bit, like in the late 40s, but by the 50s, it spread to pretty much everywhere else in the country. You think about some of the suburbs around Minneapolis today, um, Bloomington, Richfield, St. Louis Park. These are places. Sorry, these are places that were the 1950s suburbs around Minneapolis. They're kind of the old suburbs now when we think about it. At least in our minds, we're probably thinking of Lakeville, Burnsville, Apple Valley as suburbs. But you go back to the 50s, there wasn't much in Burnsville, Apple Valley, Lakeville. Those places really were, not suburbs yet or didn't even exist yet. But the Richfields, the St. Louis Park, um, Bloomington were starting to be built up, and all these young people were getting married, and they needed homes, and they were moving to the suburbs. A lot of the veterans were able to buy or build a home due to the GI Bill that was helping them out. We're not just talking about a few thousand or hundreds of thousand; we're talking about millions. So the American economy really starts to boom. Our gross domestic product went from 200 billion to 500 billion in 10 years. Today, if you looked up our gross domestic product, it's of the United States, it's like 19 trillion. But what we're seeing is a growing middle class that's making more money than ever before. And so now they're able to build a home with cheaper payments than living in an apartment in the cities. Cars, everybody can afford a car, and they're driving from the suburbs to the cities to work. And think of like these suburbs. I mean, these towns are just popping up overnight. Basically, are being created. These developments, kind of just cookie cutter homes. They all pretty much look the same. One of the other new developments in our country was the interstate highway or freeways that are being created. And you can kind of see in Minnesota, we've got 35 kind of coming out of Duluth that's going to cross all the way down to Corpus Christi, Texas. We've got I-94, Interstate 94, which crosses the country. We've got I-90, which crosses the country. And so we have all these big freeways being created. And of course, that's going to help bring people quickly to different places in the country. The bad news is these freeways bypass the little towns. You no longer have to drive through a little town when you're on these freeways crossing the country. You can drive fast. You don't have to slow down for stoplights, however, or slow down to go through little towns. You've all probably watched the movie Cars. right? That shows you how those little towns kind of dried up because of people aren't driving through spending their money there anymore. But this also is going to help with the suburbs because if you're in the suburb, you can just hop on the freeway and shoot up to your place of work, your place of business. The average family in the 1950s was living on just over $3,000 a year. And you might think, ooh, $3,000 a year is not very much. But of course, you consider inflation and everything like that. A gallon of milk was 82 cents, a gallon of gas was 23 cents. Got the milkman here that delivered milk to your house every day. Now, times were not necessarily good for everybody. We're going to be getting into the civil rights unit, equal rights unit in a little bit. Uh, and that's going to be really get going in the 1950s and really ramped up in the 1960s. So just keep in mind, like things were not necessarily good for everybody everywhere in the 1950s. One of the innovations that's really going to change things is television. Before 1950, most people did not have a television. You had to be pretty wealthy to own a television, and there wasn't necessarily a ton of things on TV. By the end of the 1950s, 90% of all households in the country had a television, and the wealthy people had colored televisions. But most people just had a black and white television, like you see in the pictures here. These black and white televisions probably only had, 2, 3, 4, 5 channels tops. There was no remote. You had to get up to change the channel. Sometimes there wasn't anything on TV. It was just kind of a fuzzy screen. But we're going to see the beginning of television. These television shows. Obviously, there was news programs, but there was a lot of TV shows that started off in the 1950s. That some of them, or a lot of them, you've probably still heard of today. And then also advertising. Now you have TV shows. You can have commercials to sell products, and people have a little bit more money in their pockets during the 1950s, and they're going to start buying some of this new stuff and filling up their houses with this new stuff. So some of the shows I think you've probably maybe watched in your life: I Love Lucy, Superman, Gunsmoke, Rin Tin Tin, The Ed Sullivan Show, Dennis the Menace, Leave It to Beaver in the late 1950s, The Twilight Zone in the late 1950s into the 60s. And so these were shows that everybody across the country was watching at the same time. And you now have a shared experience between people living in New York and people living in Texas, people living in California and people living in Iowa. They're all kind of watching the same thing. And then when they turn the TV on, they're seeing commercials for the same products. And now you're going to start to see people buying the same products all over the country. Rather than regional differences, everybody's kind of buying the same things. So, 1930s, Great Depression, 1940s, World War II, there was rationing. Now all of a sudden, 1950s, there's money to spend. And people are going to start buying the products that they're seeing on television. I do have some commercials. I'll have a link to that later. There's some interesting 1950s commercials. Notice like the ad here. My wash days are holidays now. Talking about a washing machine. People don't have to wash things by hand. You've got the electric toaster. You've got electric ovens. You've got um, the electric iron to iron clothing. So there's all these new appliances to go into the home. Sometimes people had no idea how they worked. People signed up for a seminar and went to like the school or something or city hall and learned how these appliances worked. Here's a typical 1950s kitchen. When I see a kitchen like this, I think of my grandparents' home that would have been built. I think they built it in 1950 in New Prague, and kitchen would have looked very similar to this. Now, certainly, maybe one of the downsides, or maybe not maybe, but for sure, a downside of this is women were expected to be housewives. Everything that they were seeing from television to magazines to newspapers was basically telling them your role is to be in the house. You should be getting married. You should be having lots of kids. And your role is to cook, clean, and take care of the kids, raise the kids. And that's your job. By the 1960s, we see some backlash from this as women are saying, I'm not happy with this. There's more to me than just being a housewife. And we're gonna see that during the equal rights movement a little bit as well, as women want more out of life than being a housewife. They're not happy with that. Oh, here's some film stars, 1950s icons: Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor, some big movie stars. This 1950s era is gonna lead to the baby boom. In 1946, so this is right after World War II ends, a record number of babies are born in the United States, 3.4 million. So what you're looking at is these soldiers all come home and start having kids. About 4 million babies are born each year during the 1950s. And so families are having lots of kids. This is a little different than today. Right now, yes, there's still big families out there, but the average woman is having just over 2 kids. Um, and so the average family is just over 2 kids, right around two. During the 1950s, you're talking about average families that are having 5, 6, 7 kids per family. So that's why they call it the baby boom. It tapers off in 1964. So I think they kind of say the baby boom is like 1947 to 1964. There were almost 77 million baby boomers. This was a big generation of people, and they controlled a lot of power for a long time because there were so many of them that when you turned on the radio stations, they had baby boomer music on these stations for a long time because they're the ones that were paying for this. They had the money; they were paying for the advertising. What the people that were making things to sell, they were catering to the baby boomers for a long time. That is starting to disappear as the baby boomers are old and starting to die. Now, these kids needed some toys. When you think of 1950s toys, you should be thinking of the hula hoop, the frisbee. If you were lucky enough, you might get a Schwinn bike. Here's your radio flyer um, wagon, Mr. Potato Head. A lot of the toys from Toy Story are kind of your 1950s toys a little bit. Not Buzz Lightyear, he'd be a newer one, right? Kid just got him. But when you think of like Woody, Mr. Potato Head, the dinosaur, they're kind of 1950s style. Barbie was new in the 1950s. Gumby. Movies kind of had to up their game. People in the 1950s were saying, TV is going to replace going to the movie theater. Movie theaters will die off. What if we found that did not happen? So sometimes something new will replace something old, and sometimes it doesn't. But you have to kind of change the experience. In my lifetime, what's changed with the movie theaters? Well, it used to be all the seats were on the floor, right? And you were always looking up at the movie. Well, probably when I was in high school, the late, the early 2000s, what we started to see was stadium seating, which was nice because now you can look straight out. Um, well, now what's the next change that's happened? You've got nice comfortable chairs. You can recline those chairs. You can order like really good food at these things. You can get pizza and hamburgers and french fries and all that stuff. I'm pretty old school. I'm not going to go to the movie theater and get a pizza or a hamburger. I'm popcorn and pop and maybe some candy, but not too much. I'm a popcorn and pop type of guy. But some of these movies had to get better. Some of them you heard of, some you haven't, but big movie stars. Now, this was kind of starting to be the end of the era where um, the big Hollywood film companies basically signed a contract for the actors and actresses, and producers and directors. And so what you had is these studios would basically sign a person to a contract for 5 years and basically tell them this is the movie you're going to do. And that's over now, right? Everybody's kind of a hired gun. Bridge on the River Kwai, Rebel Without a Cause, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Ten Commandments that you see every year on around Easter time, The Lady and the Tramp. This was the highest grossing film of the 1950s. It made more money than any other film during the 1950s. Still a good one, right? Peter Pan, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, classics. Some Like It Hot, starring Marilyn Monroe, Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon. Jack Lemmon, you might see him in like Grumpy Old Men, but he was a young guy then. Gene Kelly, Humphrey Bogart in one of the great movies of all time, Casablanca. It's an old movie from the like 1942, but you would like it. It is, even though it's old, it's still pretty good. Pretty good actors. I can't remember his name right now. I think he just died. Jimmy Stewart, Tony Bennett, Bob Hope, comedian, Elizabeth Taylor, Marilyn Monroe. Now, we also start to see a little bit of a rebellion in the 1950s. You don't see much rebellion really in the 30s or 40s, maybe with like the mob and stuff, but certainly not really a teen rebellion where teenagers start to rebel. And we start to see that here in the 50s. Think of Grease, right? When you watch the movie Grease, if you've seen that one, kind of the Greasers or whatever. What's the other one? The Outsiders, the Greasers, right? Stay Golden, Pony Boy. So some of these teenagers start looking at some of this pop culture and idols and things like that and how to act. James Dean was one of these symbols of misfits, kind of. His movie Rebel Without a Cause. Natalie Wood, she died young as well. But James Dean was kind of one of these symbols, this rebel, kind of had the leather jacket, the hair slicked back. He dies in 1955 in a car wreck. So he dies young. Then this is the era of the beats, the beatniks. You wouldn't really consider them to be hippies, but maybe like a generation before the hippies. And they start to kind of change the counterculture in some of the things they were writing about and they were talking about and writing poems and books about were definitely shocking to people at the time, and people would have considered it very vulgar. Books and poems about drugs and alcohol, sex, those types of things. They rejected materialism. Wore their hair different, and this definitely kind of shocked people. This is Allen Ginsberg, who wrote a book or a poem called Howl, and the police arrested him for this because it was so obscene. By today's standards, yeah, I think it would be something that maybe you wouldn't want high school kids. A teacher might get frowned upon for letting their kids read it. Certainly, college maybe would be a time where the professor might have kids read Howl, but it's not. It's definitely not as shocking today as it was in the 1950s. On the Road by Jack Kerouac. He was a beatnik that basically wrote about a story of how they traveled the country to different places, and also the book was full of drugs, alcohol, that type of thing. So very shocking for the 1950s. The Beats really weren't trying to change anything. You think of the hippies in the 60s and 70s, or beatniks in 60s and 70s. They're kind of trying to change the world a little bit. Peace, love, rock and roll, that type of thing. The Beats just didn't want to be normal, that type of thing. Rebels without a cause. Another thing that the older generation of the 1950s did not really care for was rock and roll. And rock and roll was new. And by the end of the 1950s, it was taking over. You think of the old songs, guys like, who am I thinking of? Hang on here. Frank Sinatra. Thinking Frank Sinatra. You could really kind of hear their words very clearly. It was slower music, lounge singer type music. By the 1950s, rock and roll is really taking over. Elvis Presley kind of got it started. He didn't invent rock and roll, but he was the king of rock and roll. And he starts it in 1956. You've got, you know, the older generation thought it was very obscene. He kind of would shake his hips a little bit, and dancing on stage as he played the guitar and sang his songs. And people were kind of shocked by this and did not think this was a good influence. Today, we would think it's very tame by today's standards. Some other rock and roll guys: Chuck Berry. You've heard some of his music. Johnny B. Good, Buddy Holly. You might have heard some of his music. 1959, they call it the day that music died. You had three rock and roll guys die in a plane crash in Clear Lake, Iowa. That's where Shep is from. Of course, it's probably not Shep's fault that this happened, so don't blame Shep. But he is from there, so give him a dirty look every once in a while. But anyway, Buddy Holly, probably the most well-known on there, dies in that plane crash. You've got Richie Valens, you've got the Big Bopper, and the pilot all die in that plane crash. I'm pretty sure you can't hear the Sinatra music playing. But even though it was the 1950s and rock and roll was new, Frank Sinatra he was still number one in the charts. The older generation was listening to his music, and he was still number one. I think the Weavers were number two. Motown in Detroit starts making music at this time. They'll be bigger in the 60s, but Diana Ross and the Supremes, and they'll lead the way for people like the Jackson 5 and Michael Jackson and other groups, Stevie Wonder. I'll have some links later on some of the rock and roll of the 50s. Some other 1950s innovations. You think of the drive-in restaurants and things like that, but we're going to see our first franchises. And McDonald's is really one of the first franchises that spreads across the country, where when you walk into a McDonald's, it doesn't matter if you're in Minnesota, Texas, Iowa, California, New York, wherever you go, you pretty much know what's going to be on the menu. There's no surprises. You're not going to walk into a restaurant and say, there's really nothing on this menu that I want. And so McDonald's is kind of the first, and they basically got their start by serving hamburgers and shakes. That's it. Hamburgers, French fries, and shakes. 15 cents. Some new books. Kids learn to read on things like "See it go." Look, said Dick. See it go. See it go up. Jane said, "Oh, look, see it go. See it go up." Up, up, said Sally. Go up, up. Yeah, that's not going to really keep kids too excited about reading. It's not really going to lock them in. Now you're going to see things like The Cat in the Hat pop up, Dr. Seuss books. So things get a little more entertaining. The first credit card, where you don't have to actually pay right away. You can swipe your credit card and pay later, is going to pop up in 1950. The diner's card doesn't exist anymore. This would have been people carrying it around all over the place. See, it starts in New York City here. This one, somebody owned it in Los Angeles. Credit card can be dangerous because eventually you have to pay. A credit card doesn't want you to pay every month. What do they want you to do? Not pay it all every month, and then they can charge you interest. Peanuts cartoon. Charles Schulz from St. Paul, Minnesota, starts his Peanut cartoons in newspapers with Snoopy and Charlie Brown and Lucy. Seatbelts are new in 1952. And the cars of the 50s. You'll hear people talk. We'll see some pictures of the cars of the 50s. Obviously, those are some really important, when you go to the old car shows and stuff like that and car parades, you'll see 1950s cars. Tupperware. We all have this in our homes probably. Plastic Tupperware was new. Disneyland was new. Polio vaccine. People used to get polio all the time, and polio could kill you. It could cripple you. It definitely was something that people worried about. Polio was a a a virus, a disease where it could be very contagious. So when an area of the country or a town or a neighborhood, if somebody had polio, they quarantined you. You didn't go play with other kids. Jonas Salk invents the vaccine. My dad, who was born in '53, says he remembers taking the vaccine in elementary school and being vaccinated for polio. Now we never hear about people getting polio. That's good. Baseball was king. Baseball was the number one sport in the '50s. Football was just kind of getting going. Basketball really wasn't big. Hockey wasn't big. Baseball was king, and the Yankees were the best team. Guys like Mickey Mantle were huge stars. Yogi Berra, huge stars during the 1950s. You can't hear this song that's playing. It's too bad. It's a good one. Maybe I'll put a link to it. And had done it. Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, and so for the first time during the 1950s, we see African Americans being allowed to play in the major leagues, and that's gonna become more and more prevalent. The girl on Jeopardy, College Jeopardy, the other day just got this wrong when they asked which Major League Baseball player broke the color barrier, and she said Babe Ruth. And I thought, it's not that you're getting a sports question wrong because most of those Jeopardy people are not sports people. The problem is this is American history. This is a huge deal, and we'll talk more about it when we get to 19 the civil rights era. Some other big stars of the 50s. I mentioned Mantle, um, but you've got Willie Mays, one of the great players of all time, New York Giants. You got Duke Schneider, Brooklyn Dodgers. Ted Williams. Ted Williams, maybe the greatest left-handed hitter of all time. He missed a lot of years because he went and fought in World War II and the Korean War. So he missed out on a lot of his career flying fighter jets during those wars. Some football players. You got Johnny Unitas of the 1950s of the Colts, Jim Brown of the Cleveland Browns. You think about appliances at the time, the microwave was invented, but it was very expensive. The first microwave cost the same as a new car. And here's some of the cars of the 50s. Drive-in theaters, drive-in restaurants where they might bring the food to your car, eat it in your car. Alaska and Hawaii became our 49th and 50th states.